They tell you Germany's defensive lines collapsed under waves of Sherman tanks. They show you grainy footage of paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines, P-47 Thunderbolts screaming through smoke-filled skies, Patton's armored columns smashing through French hedgerows. Every documentary, every history book, every Hollywood blockbuster repeats the same story. American armor, elite infantry, overwhelming air power. That's what broke the Wehrmacht's grip on Europe. They're all missing the actual weapon that destroyed Germany's ability to defend anything. One artillery piece. The M2 105mm Howitzer. Not sexy, not dramatic, just a 4,900-pound tube of steel that systematically erased defensive warfare through pure mathematics. While historians argue about which tank commander was more brilliant or which airborne operation was more daring, the M2 was quietly making defense itself statistically impossible. Let's kill the biggest myth right now. The M2 wasn't just another field gun sitting behind the lines lobbing shells at random. It was the most mass-produced artillery piece in human history. American factories stamped out 10,400 of these weapons between 1,941 and 1,953. Think about that number. Not dozens, not hundreds. Over 10,000 identical guns, all firing the same shells, all following the same doctrine, all pointed at German defensive positions from Normandy to the Rhine. But here's what German commanders discovered when they actually faced this weapon in combat. The M2 could maintain 4 rounds per minute, hour after hour, without breaking down. American artillery doctrine grouped these guns into batteries of 6. Do the math with me. 6 guns, 4 rounds each per minute. That's 24 shells screaming downrange every 60 seconds. Keep that gun line firing for an hour. 1,440 shells. Push it for a full day of operations. Over 34,000 rounds from a single battery. The Germans were facing artillery fire rates that exceeded their entire daily ammunition production for comparable weapons. Not some of their production, all of it. The Luftwaffe at its peak couldn't deliver this much explosive force. Their vaunted panzer divisions couldn't match this destruction rate. Even the Tiger tanks that haunt every World War II documentary were irrelevant against this volume of fire. This wasn't theoretical firepower written in some manual. This was actual battlefield mathematics that broke actual armies. A German defensive position that took months to build, that required tons of concrete and steel, that should have held for weeks under normal artillery fire. The M2 turned it into a crater field in hours. Every bunker, every trench line, every carefully prepared killing zone. Mathematics said they couldn't survive. And mathematics doesn't care about courage or tactical genius or defensive fortifications. German defenders weren't facing artillery support. They were facing mathematical extinction. But here's where it gets truly devastating. Raw firepower alone doesn't break armies. Plenty of nations had artillery that could fire fast. The Soviets were throwing shells at German positions by the tens of thousands on the Eastern Front. What made the M2 different wasn't just the rate of fire. It was the system behind it. Before 1940, artillery worked like this. You had guns spread across miles of front line. Each gun crew did their own calculations. Each battery commander made their own targeting decisions. You pointed your gun in the general direction of enemy positions, fired a bunch of shells, hoped some of them hit something important. It was educated guessing wrapped in trigonometry. Sometimes it worked. Usually it wasted ammunition hitting empty dirt. Then American artillery officers invented something that changed killing forever: the Fire Direction Center. One centralized location with plotting boards, radios, and officers doing nothing but mathematics. They could coordinate dozens of batteries positioned miles apart to strike a single target simultaneously. Not approximately the same target, the exact same coordinate. German defenders weren't facing one howitzer battery firing from one direction. They were facing synchronized devastation from artillery pieces they couldn't even see. all converging on their position from different angles at the same moment. Picture yourself in a German bunker. You hear American guns firing from the west. You brace for impact. Then shells start landing from the north, from the south, from positions you didn't even know existed, all hitting your trench line within seconds of each other. You're not being bombarded. You're being surgically removed from the battlefield. World War I artillery was area bombardment. Flatten everything in a square kilometer and hope the enemy is in there somewhere. M2-era artillery was coordinate targeting. American forward observers radioed back exact positions. Fire direction centers calculated trajectory. Shells landed within 50 yards of intended targets. Adjust fire procedures, let them walk rounds onto bunkers like a sniper squeezing a trigger. The Germans were still using field telephone networks that dated back to 1918. Americans were using radio networks that could coordinate fire missions across an entire division front in minutes. But it gets worse for anyone trying to defend against this weapon. The M2 wasn't just a howitzer. It was an entire weapon system crammed into one gun tube. High explosive shells for bunkers and personnel. White phosphorus for smoke screens and suppression. Armor-piercing rounds for direct fire against tanks. Variable time fuses that detonated shells in airburst above trenches, shredding anyone who thought they were safe in a hole. A German commander couldn't prepare for one type of attack. He had to prepare for 5 different threats from the same gun. He needed overhead cover for airbursts, thick concrete for high explosive, dispersion to avoid white phosphorus, different positions to counter direct fire. He didn't have the resources to defend against all of them. Nobody did. The M2 wasn't a weapon. It was an entire artillery doctrine compressed into 4,900 pounds of steel, and it could deliver any form of destruction American officers wanted, whenever they wanted it, exactly where they wanted it. You don't have to take America's word for any of this. The Germans told the truth themselves. July 1944. Near St. Lo in Normandy, American forces captured a German infantry officer who'd been commanding a defensive position in the hedgerows. During interrogation, he described what American artillery actually felt like from the receiving end. American artillery wasn't random bombardment like the Great War. It was surgical destruction. They could place shells exactly where they wanted them, exactly when they wanted them. Every defensive position we prepared, every supply route we used, every communication trench we dug. Nothing was safe from their mathematical precision. Read that again. This wasn't an American after-action report exaggerating success. This was a German officer explaining why his position fell. He used the word surgical. He understood what was happening. His defensive doctrine assumed artillery would be imprecise, wasteful, something you could endure if you dug deep enough. Instead, he faced weapons that knew exactly where he was and could kill him whenever they decided to. The psychological weight wasn't just the explosions. It was knowing that death was scheduled, not random. Late 1944, Allied intelligence interrogated a captured German artillery battalion commander. What he revealed was even more devastating than frontline accounts. He'd done the math on ammunition expenditure before the campaign started. He expected to face artillery operating under World War I standards, maybe 50 rounds per gun per day for sustained operations. The Americans fired 500 rounds per gun daily, 10 times what German defensive planning assumed. Not double, not triple, 10 times. He sat there telling his interrogators that Germany's entire defensive strategy was built on mathematical assumptions that were a generation out of date. They'd calculated how much ammunition they needed to stockpile, how many counter-battery missions they could sustain, how long their positions could endure bombardment. Every single calculation was off by an order of magnitude. We were fighting a war from 1918. They brought 1944. But the darkest proof came from German defensive manuals themselves. Between 1943 and 1943 945, Wehrmacht headquarters rewrote their defensive doctrine multiple times. Each revision told the same story. Instructions shifted from hold positions at all costs to avoid American artillery concentrations through constant movement. Later revisions explicitly authorized commanders to abandon positions under sustained fire. Germany's own words proved the M2 had won before American infantry even advanced. Their doctrine manuals were surrender documents written in military language. A German defensive position wasn't something you threw together in an afternoon. It was a capital investment. Concrete fortifications required tons of raw material transported to the front. Reinforced bunkers took specialized engineering units weeks to construct properly. Elaborate trench systems consumed thousands of man-hours of labor. You needed steel reinforcement, timber supports, camouflage materials, drainage systems. Look at the Siegfried Line. Germany spent years building these fortifications before the war even started. The Atlantic Wall consumed astronomical resources. Engineers surveyed terrain, planned fields of fire, poured concrete, installed steel doors, positioned machine guns for interlocking coverage. These weren't battlefield expedients. These were industrial-scale construction projects that represented Germany's investment in defensive warfare. A single M2 battery could destroy these positions in hours. The shells cost less than the concrete. The gun crew numbered 8 men versus construction teams of hundreds. The time factor was absurd. What took months to build vanished in an afternoon of sustained fire. You could reconstruct the entire economic equation of defensive warfare. Destruction had become more efficient than construction. Every fortification Germany built was a sunk cost waiting to be erased. The replacement rate made defense mathematically impossible. German positions were being destroyed faster than they could be built. Labor that should have been preparing new defensive lines was redirected to rebuilding positions that had already fallen. Resources poured into a futile cycle of construction and destruction where destruction always won. Here's the industrial capacity gap that actually ended the war. American factories were producing millions of artillery shells per month. Millions. German concrete production couldn't keep pace with replacement needs for destroyed fortifications. They were trying to build faster than America could manufacture shells. That's not a war. That's an economic death spiral. American artillery officers calculated the brutal efficiency. One M2 Howitzer firing for 8 hours delivered more explosive force than an entire German artillery regiment could produce in a full day, given their ammunition shortages. The industrial advantage wasn't just overwhelming, it was reality versus fantasy. German defensive doctrine assumed artillery support capabilities that simply didn't exist at American production levels. Defense had become a resource hemorrhage Germany couldn't afford. You could see it in the strategic decisions. As the war progressed, Germany stopped building elaborate fortifications, not because they didn't want them, because they'd done the math. Any defensive position you invested resources in would be systematically destroyed before it paid tactical dividends. Every bunker was throwing money into a crater. Germany was trying to build walls faster than America could manufacture keys. The mathematics were unwinnable from the start. Here's how the M2 actually changed battlefield tactics in ways that made traditional defense impossible. American forces deployed artillery at densities nobody had seen before. Roughly 1 M2 howitzer for every 500 yards of front line. Some sectors pushed even tighter ratios during major offensives. What this created wasn't just fire support. It was overlapping kill zones that covered every inch of German-held territory. No dead ground, no safe areas, no place to hide. German defenders couldn't move during daylight hours. Supply columns trying to bring ammunition forward got shredded on approach roads. Reinforcements couldn't reach frontline positions. Communication runners between defensive positions were cut down in open ground. The artillery didn't just hit what it could see. It hit everything that moved within registered coordinates. Compare this to World War I artillery density. 1 gun per 2,000 yards of front was considered heavy concentration. Even on the Eastern Front, where both sides deployed massive artillery formations, the ratios never approached what Americans brought to France. The M2 deployment created something new. Not artillery support. Artillery suffocation. German defenders were trapped in a mathematical kill zone, where movement meant death and staying still meant eventual destruction. But the real revolution was how this changed combined arms warfare. Traditional doctrine said artillery supported infantry attacks. You bombarded enemy positions, then infantry advanced to capture ground. The M2 inverted this relationship. Artillery became the attack itself. Infantry became the consolidation force that secured what artillery had already destroyed. American tactics evolved around this reality. Creeping barrages where shells landed just 100 yards ahead of advancing infantry. The barrage crept forward on a timed schedule. German defenders couldn't raise their heads to fire at advancing Americans because shells were systematically walking across their positions. By the time the artillery lifted, American infantry was already on top of German trenches. Sherman tanks advanced under this umbrella of fire, not charging ahead into anti-tank fire, rolling forward while M2 batteries suppressed anything that could kill them. German anti-tank guns couldn't engage tanks because they were being hammered by high-explosive shells. Panzerfaust teams couldn't get into position because white phosphorus was turning their positions into chemical nightmares. Air support coordinated with artillery strikes. P-47 seconds would hit a target, then M2 batteries would pound it, then infantry would assault. German counterattacks were broken before they formed. Forward observers would call in fire missions on any German unit attempting to organize. By the time officers gathered their men, shells were already in the air. The M2 didn't support attacks. It was the attack. Then there were time-on-target missions, multiple batteries calculating different trajectories so all their shells arrived at the target simultaneously. Germans defending a crossroads position wouldn't hear guns firing in the distance. They'd hear nothing. Then 50 shells would detonate in the same 5-second window. No warning, no time to take cover. First indication of attack was the explosion that killed you. Sequential bombardment gave defenders time to react between salvos. Time on target eliminated reaction time entirely, made even prepared positions with overhead cover vulnerable because the sheer volume of shells arriving simultaneously overwhelmed any protection. Germans weren't dying in artillery barrages. They were dying in mathematical instants. When mathematics makes your entire defensive doctrine obsolete, you either evolve or die. Germany tried to evolve. Pre-1944 German defensive doctrine was built on World War I lessons. Linear defense: hold every meter of ground. Fortified positions as the foundation of strategy. Infantry dug into bunkers with interlocking machine gun fire. Panzers held in reserve for counterattacks against breakthrough points. Artillery positioned in prepared emplacements with pre-calculated firing data. This doctrine worked on the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery, despite massive quantities, lacked the precision and coordination of American systems. Then Germany encountered massed M2 formations in France. The doctrine shattered. Casualty rates in static positions became unsustainable. Units defending prepared fortifications were taking losses that exceeded units conducting mobile operations. The thing that was supposed to protect German soldiers' elaborate defensive positions was killing them faster than anything else. Position loss rates were catastrophic. Strong points fell within hours instead of the weeks planning documents assumed. Wehrmacht headquarters issued emergency doctrinal revisions. New doctrine emphasized elastic defense in depth. Thin screening forces forward. Main defensive strength positioned miles behind the front in mobile formations. Trade space for survival. Refused to concentrate forces where American artillery could find them. Abandoned positions under sustained fire rather than die for empty ground. This wasn't tactical preference. This was forced adaptation to survive American artillery mathematics. Look at Normandy's hedgerows. Perfect defensive terrain. Each hedgerow was a natural fortification 4 feet thick with centuries-old root systems. Concealment, cover, channeled movement into killing zones. German defenders initially used them brilliantly. Every field became a miniature fortress. Then American artillery batteries arrived in strength and registered every hedgerow intersection, pre-plotted every approach route, turned natural fortifications into killing grounds. German defenders were trapped. Leave your hedgerow position, and you're exposed to direct fire. Stay in your hedgerow, and American forward observers call down precision strikes on your exact location. What should have been weeks of grinding combat through bocage country collapsed in days. Hedgerows went from Germany's greatest advantage to a death trap. Defenders started requesting permission to abandon hedgerow positions and withdraw to open country where they could at least move. The inversion was complete. German soldiers were seeking open ground to escape artillery fire. Then there's the Siegfried Line. Germany's prepared fortifications along the border. Years of construction, engineering excellence, concrete bunkers with interlocking fire, dragon's teeth tank obstacles, minefields. Everything defensive doctrine said should be impregnable. M2 batteries systematically reduced these positions. Fortifications that were supposed to protect defenders became aiming points. Defenders requested permission to abandon bunkers and fight from field positions. Officers reported, "We're safer in the open than in these concrete coffins." The M2 forced Germany to abandon the very concept of defensive warfare. Not defeat it, make it strategically impossible. Let's synthesize all of this into the single truth that actually ended the war. American industrial capacity versus German industrial capacity wasn't a fair fight. It was mathematics pretending to be combat. Shell production America manufactured millions of artillery rounds per month. Germany produced thousands of comparable munitions while simultaneously trying to supply their entire war machine. Artillery pieces 10,000, 400 m, 2 howitzers versus roughly 4,000 comparable German field guns across all fronts. Ammunition stockpiles. American units operated with effectively bottomless supplies, while German gunners were rationed to specific round counts per day. The fundamental equation that decided World War II. American production exceeded German destruction capacity by orders of magnitude. Germany couldn't kill M2 howitzers faster than American factories built them. Couldn't destroy incoming shells faster than production lines stamped them out. Couldn't construct defensive positions faster than artillery reduced them to rubble. Every single metric favored America by ratios that made tactical excellence irrelevant. The M2 wasn't just a weapon. It was American industrial capacity materialized into explosive force. Each shell represented a factory in Detroit, a worker in Pennsylvania, a resource extraction network spanning continents, a logistics system that could move millions of tons of material across an ocean. Germany wasn't fighting an artillery piece. They were fighting the American economy. And you cannot defeat an economy with tactics. Look at what happened after the war. Modern artillery doctrine traces directly to M2 operations. Self-propelled howitzers combined mobility with M2 firepower concepts. Multiple launch rocket systems scaled the saturation principle that M2 batteries pioneered. Precision-guided munitions perfected the accuracy that fire direction centers introduced. Every modern military studied how Americans employed the M2 and built their artillery doctrine from those lessons. The Soviets observed American operations and developed deep battle doctrine, partially based on what massed artillery could accomplish. NATO artillery tactics descended directly from World War II American formations. Even adversaries recognized they were witnessing the future of warfare industrial production capacity, determining outcomes regardless of individual weapon excellence. The legacy is everywhere once you know to look for it. The concept that artillery doesn't support attacks but is the attack. The understanding that coordinated fires matter more than individual gun performance. The recognition that overwhelming volume of fire changes fundamental battlefield mathematics. So here's where we end up. While historians still debate which tank commander was more brilliant, which airborne operation was more decisive, which air campaign was more effective, the M2 howitzer was methodically erasing defensive warfare through simple mathematics, not through heroism, not through tactical genius, through production numbers and industrial capacity that made German excellence strategically irrelevant. Germany had superior tanks at various points in the war, excellent infantry, brilliant tactical commanders, defensive positions built to engineering perfection. None of it mattered. America had M2 howitzers in quantities that turned excellence into a footnote. The M2 didn't just break Germany's defense. It broke the illusion that tactical genius could defeat industrial mathematics. Wars aren't won on battlefields. They're won in factories. The howitzer proved it.